What's up, millennials? Have you ever thought about buying Bitcoin? That's the question for today. Because if you haven't, well, go no further, because in this video, we're going to be talking about an investment fund called ARK Invest, which is investing more than $46 million in Bitcoin. Okay, and ARK Invest just released 2 white papers in which they pretty much explain why they do that. I'm going to be making 3 videos in total. The first video is going to be talking about the first white paper of ARK Invest, in which they talk about why Bitcoin is good as a financial institution. In the second video, I'll talk about why Bitcoin is good as an investment. And in the third video, I'll simply show you how you can buy your first Bitcoin. So in this video, we're going to be looking at 4 of the reasons why ARK Invest thinks that the Bitcoin network is actually better than the old legacy institutions like banks and companies like PayPal. So before we jump into these 4 reasons, let's take a look at what ARK Invest is and what they're investing in exactly, okay? So ARK Invest is an investment group, an investment fund, which is basically focused on disruptive innovation. They're looking at companies who are likely to do very well in the future, and they've also got their own ETFs. ETFs are exchange-traded funds, which is pretty much like a basket full of companies which you can buy at once. So if you buy an ETF, you buy various companies at once. So ARK Invest has 5 ETFs, which we can see over here, which are the ARK Innovation ETF, the Autonomous Technology and Robotics ETF, Next Generation Internet, the Genomic Revolution, and the Fintech Innovation ETF. And ARK Invest is also betting on Bitcoin, which is in their Next Generation Internet ETF, ARKW. So if we take a look at ARKW, we see that Grayscale Bitcoin Trust is in position number 20. This has its ticker symbol GBTC. And GBTC is like an investment fund that does hold Bitcoin, and institutions like ARK Invest can actually buy shares of this Bitcoin fund so that they do own Bitcoin, but they don't actually need to hold it and secure it themselves, okay? So as we can see in this PDF on the website of ARK Invest, we can see that about 2% of the ARKW fund is in Bitcoin, which is currently about $46 million in Bitcoin, which is actually more than other companies, other big companies we can see in this list, companies like Amazon, Netflix, Adobe, Twitter, and PayPal, which is a pretty good sign, right? So let's take a look at reason number 1 why ARK Invest thinks that Bitcoin is actually a pretty good network. Reason number 1 is that value should be exchanged globally and freely, which basically means, well, if you want to send money to a friend of yours, for example, you should be able to do that. But ARK Invest says that there are certain centralized institutions like banks and other online platforms like PayPal, which put limitations on what kind of people can actually use their systems, but also on the amount of money that you can send to other people. ARK, for example, mentions stories of people who were using PayPal, but they simply were kicked off the platform for no apparent reason at all. And sometimes even the government can get involved and tell platforms like PayPal to simply kick certain companies off their platforms. So let's take a look at one of the figures within the white paper of ARK Invest. In figure number 1, we see that there are more and more countries who are increasing the amount of control they have over their citizens. Let's take a look at the red line first, okay? The red line indicates the amount of countries that were reducing their control over their citizens. First, we see a kind of a big spike over here around 1993. And we see that around 25% of the countries were reducing their control. If we go fast forward and we go to pretty much the present, we see that only 5% of countries are reducing the amount of control they have over their citizens. Now, if we look at the blue line, it's pretty much the opposite. First, not a lot of countries were increasing their control. But now, if we scroll forward to 2020, we see that around 15% of the countries are increasing their control. So that's not a very good sign, is it? So basically what that means is that countries simply have more control over citizens, people just like you and me. Then if we take a look at the Bitcoin network, we see that pretty much everyone can participate. There is no institution saying, well, you cannot participate because we don't like you, or you can just send like $10,000 because, hey, that's simply what we want. No, in the Bitcoin network, everyone can participate. And also, Bitcoin users can send any amount of value at any time to anyone in the world. So yes, that's one of the reasons why ARK Invest thinks that the Bitcoin network is actually better than institutions, because you can exchange value globally and freely. So reason number 2, ARK Invest says that wealth should be protected and owned wholly. What does that mean? Well, basically, we all need to rely right now on institutions like banks to protect our money. We need to trust banks that they don't actually take our money. And we also need to trust them that they protect our money against other people who are trying to steal it. Okay, so if we take a look at figure number 2, which is right over here. In this figure, what they try to represent is how difficult it is for someone to take your things, to take your cash or your house or your gold or whatever. On the right hand, we see gold, for example, which is quite difficult to steal. You can hide gold in your house in a vault, for example, and it will be very difficult to steal for other people. And a little bit on the left, we see real estate. It's quite difficult as well to steal a house, for example. You can't just take a house and put it in your pocket and run away. Then we have physical cash, which is already a little bit more easy to steal because, hey, if you are walking on the street and someone takes your wallet, they can simply run away with it and use your cash to pay for stuff. And then on the left-hand side, we see digital cash, which is basically just a bunch of, well, zeros and ones on the internet, which can be stolen quite easily in comparison to the other assets that we have been talking about. But if we look at Bitcoin, well, Bitcoin is very well protected by something that's called cryptography. And what you can also do is you can put your Bitcoin on a ledger, which we can see on the website over here, which is basically like a USB stick or something like that, which you can connect to your computer. And you simply have your own private keys, your own passwords to protect the access to this wallet. So basically, a ledger is like a wallet, okay? And apart from just being a wallet, it also has private keys to make it even more secure. So those are a few reasons why ARK Invest thinks that Bitcoin is even more safe than all the things we have been mentioning before. It's definitely safer than digital cash, more safe than physical cash, real estate, gold. It's simply entirely on the right-hand side of this figure, as we can see over here. Because, well, Bitcoin is something you can store offline and you need those private keys to get access to your Bitcoin. So yes, the Bitcoin network is actually better because your money is simply well protected. Next up, reason number 3. ARK Invest says that the rules should be enforced reliably and predictably. Well, that's a problem in the case of these centrally controlled institutions because they can simply enforce the rules and change the rules whenever they want. During the Corona crisis, for example, we have seen a lot of quantitative easing, which pretty much meant that there were no restrictions on the amount of money that was being printed, which leads to inflation. And inflation is pretty bad because your money becomes less valuable over time. You don't really want that, right? By using the compound interest calculator on my website, you can actually see how much money you can lose due to inflation over time. Here I used an example in which someone has, for example, $10,000 to start with, okay? And the annual interest rate, well, pretty much nowadays is basically 0, so let's put it at that. The inflation rate is around 1.5%, And let's say that we wait for 20 years to see how much money we are left with. Well, we can see that first we had 10,000, and after 20 years, we only have 7,400 euros left, which is basically, well, 25% less than what we started out with. So institutions like central banks can actually decide how much quantitative easing they want to apply, but individuals like you and me are getting the disadvantages because our money becomes worth less and less. So how does that work exactly in the case of Bitcoin? Well, first of all, the Bitcoin network is like a system of computers that all follow the same rules. And if one computer tries to break a rule, then the other computers will simply reject the information. And apart from that, there is also no money printing involved here, okay? There is simply a fixed amount of Bitcoin. There is going to be a fixed amount of 21 Bitcoin over time. So it is very predictable how many Bitcoins there are going to be over time. And we also know exactly how many Bitcoins there have been made until now. If we go to this website, for example, we can see that there are almost 18.5 million Bitcoins in existence. Okay, so we know that there are going to be 2.5 million Bitcoins left to be mined. So yes, that means that the Bitcoin network is actually better than the legacy institutions because the system is very reliable and also very predictable. And then lastly, reason number 4, ARK Invest says that the integrity of the system should be verifiable. Okay, that's a problem in the case of centrally organized institutions as well, because they are not very transparent. People like you and me can't just go to the bank and say, hey, what are you doing with my money exactly? What are you doing? And one of the reasons for which banks are not super transparent is the so-called global average reserve requirement ratio. That's a pretty large word, right? What it basically means is that banks need to have enough cash in the banks so that you and me can go to the bank and say, hey, I would like to withdraw some of my money. But this becomes a problem if we all went to the bank on the same day at the same time to reclaim all our money back. Because simply no bank in the world has enough money to pay all of their customers their money back if they actually wanted to do so. But what they do need is a certain percentage of money that was deposited by their clients. Let's say a bank has, for example, $1 million in the bank, okay? Let's say there are clients of a bank and all of these clients in total dropped $1 million in the bank. The bank doesn't really need to keep that $1 million. It has to keep around, as we can see in this figure, around 5% right now of that $1 million, which is only $50,000. So apart from that $50,000, they don't really need to keep that money. They can do other things with your money instead. And because these banks only have to keep a certain percentage of the money, we simply don't really know, or it's not very transparent, what they do with the rest of that money. So how does that work in the case of the Bitcoin network? Well, as we can see in this table, the users of the Bitcoin network can validate all the claims that are made on the Bitcoin network, okay? As we can see in this table, the users, for example, can validate all the inbound transactions. They can verify if the Bitcoins have not been spent more than once. They can see the full history of transactions that have taken place on the network. They can see, or they can verify the ownership of Bitcoin. They can verify if Bitcoins haven't been spent without access. And they can also see how many Bitcoins there are right now and how many Bitcoins there are going to be in the future. So it's very transparent the way Bitcoin network works. So there you have it. 4 reasons why ARK Invest is investing so heavily in Bitcoin. And 4 reasons why, as they say right here, why they believe that it will contribute more dramatically and profoundly to the evolution of monetary and financial systems than any other breakthrough in history. That's pretty insane if you ask me. So now I would like to know from you, if you are investing in Bitcoin, then what is your biggest reason for doing so? And if you're not investing in Bitcoin, then what is your biggest reason for not doing so? Just drop your answer in the comments below. I'll make sure to read them all. And well, with that being said, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in part 2.